Julian Barnett of London, starting with a question, and it goes as follows. What connects the Suffragettes, Tutankhamun, a very unusual swimming pool, Google, vines in the medieval period, Roman roads, Mausolus of ancient Greece, the Coptic Christians of Egypt, the Mercers of Covent Garden, and a stack of other things? Well, the answer to the question is St Giles Circus. And here I am in St Giles Circus at a particularly famous pub in the actual area, the Bloomsbury Tavern. St Giles Circus is an ancient junction of roads in London, and despite it being ancient, if you ask the vast majority of people the question, where is St Giles Circus, they wouldn't have a clue where it is, because it's actually very tiny, but deeply historic. So what I'm going to do today is something slightly different to previous walks. The previous walks and tours I've taken you on have been leisurely, sometimes to the point of slow, when I've told long stories in quite a detailed fashion. Slightly different approach today. I am going to pack one heck of a lot in the most intense few minutes of a London tour you might have ever come across. That's the challenge today, one brief walk, packing as much as I can in. Let's start here, on the rather beautifully named Grape Street. Grape Street is now a street, a typical London back street. There you can see it, Grape Street, Borough of Holborn, WC2. Grape Street itself has had that name since 1896, but in fact, this lovely street, full of buildings in the Italianate style, made out of terracotta stone, a very unusual stone, by the way, for London buildings. This street, Grape Street, was originally called Vine Street, obviously a connected word to grapes. Why was it called Vine Street? Well, it was called that because we know all the way back to the Domesday Book, 1068, that when William the Conqueror came to this country, had an entire survey of the whole country made, every single field, every single farmer, every single citizen had to explain what they were doing, how much land they owned, how many pigs and cows they had, how many hens they had, how many eggs were laid, how much land they lived on, how large their residences were, whether they were castles, whether they were manor houses, whether they were wattle and daub huts. Everything was recorded, and that became the Domesday Book. Well, we know, of course, this area was at that time just fields. We know that a man called Goodwin, Harold Goodwin, lived in this area, and he had grapevines. So that was recorded. We know Goodwin lived in this area. He was a grower and seller of grapes. Thus, this area became known as being an area for grapes. Thus, centuries and centuries later, that collective memory, oral tradition of what happened, shaped itself into the name of a street, Vine Street, which eventually became Grape Street. That's the story of that. Now, we have just walked underneath the canopy of the Shaftesbury Theatre, a beautiful old theatre. We're actually at the edge of what is now called Theatreland, but Theatreland is in effect the area all around Covent Garden where you have one of the highest concentration of theatres in the world, and we've just walked past one of them. But what I really want to point out to you is this remarkable place here, the Oasis Sports Centre. Now, the wonderful thing about this, owned by the London Borough of Camden, is that, and not a lot of people know this, and I was half hesitant about mentioning it because I thought, well, is it going to be overrun, this little London secret be overrun by thousands of people? Within that Oasis Sports Centre is a swimming pool. The swimming pool is an open-air heated swimming pool, and it is surrounded on all four sides by this building. The building is an office block, it's also a residential block, it's also part school, there's lots of facilities around there. So when you pay your dues and you go in and you have a swim in the pool, it is literally like swimming on an ocean liner, on the deck of an ocean liner with deck chairs around you and structures around you. It's quite a surreal London experience. The other wonderful thing about it is, because it's a public swimming baths in the open, one of the few in London, you get a complete cross-section of London society, people from all walks of life actually in that pool swimming. It's a great way to meet all manner of Londoners, all enjoying a wonderful public facility. Next street on, Endell Street. Endell Street had a terrible reputation in the 1930s. Number 81 Endell Street, the basement of, was a famous club called the Caravan Club. The Caravan Club was, and I quote, an unconventional club. 1935, there was a trial that was held. And that trial was of a number of people that had been arrested in a wild party in that club. All of this, of course, is a euphemism for a club that had what were considered then questionable sexual practices. It's a fantastic story. I'd urge you to read about the history of the club. Not enough time for that now, but a great history. Endell Street eventually goes down into Mercer Street, and Mercer Street again, just off St Giles Circus, is named after the Mercers, Mercer being a corruption of merchants, the ancient Latin word. And the Mercers, the most worshipful company of Mercers, are people that were involved in the luxury fabrics of velvet, of silk, of fine cotton. And that name, Mercer Street, is a reminder of what used to go on in that area at that time. Moving around the circus a little bit more, there we have it, Google, the European headquarters of Google. And it sort of looks like some of those Google colours that we're all used to having and seeing when we're working. Let's move around a bit further now, because there's a great snapshot of a view, packing, as I said, a lot into these few minutes. Let's go round, and I'd like you to see that looming Google headquarters building right behind an Edwardian building. In other words, a most wonderful juxtaposition of architectural styles in the centre of London. There we have it. Look at that. Isn't that fantastic? You can't imagine anything as more contemporary than the Google building, but then in front of it, your really traditional London mansion block of flats right in front of it. And just heading on from that is something really unusual, which is our Tutankhamun link. Let me tell you the story. November the 4th, 1922, Howard Carter discovers the tomb of Tutankhamun. He'd been digging around for years. It was the last opportunity to go for what he believed was the last remaining pharaoh unaccounted for from the point of view of a tomb being discovered. Now, we know now that the tomb of Tutankhamun was and remains the only pharaonic tomb discovered undisturbed, which is what made it arguably the most spectacular archaeological discovery in history. That spurned an absolute craze in anything to do with ancient Egypt. It was nicknamed in the newspapers at the time Tutmania, as in Tutankhamun mania. So look at this building here, built in 1922, Hend House, and we're going to go over and have a quick look at it because some of the features are really wonderful. It's a 1920s version of what ancient Egyptian style is. So there you've got it. Figures of Horus, you've got lotus branches, you've also even got a pharaonic head there. Now, none of this is precisely correct, but it conjures up these images of ancient Egypt. And around London, there's a number of these buildings that all were developed in the 1920s in the light of Tutankhamun's discovery. The ancient Egyptians were very, very keen on number patterns, and I discovered a great number pattern here. Of course, it's completely whimsical, it's just what I came across at the time and thought about it. You can see that Hend House, this Egyptian building, is number 233 Shaftesbury Avenue. Now, if you subtract 233 from 1922, the year Tutankhamun was discovered, you come to the year 1689. What is the link to 1689? Well, 1689 is the year that one of London's oldest tailoring firms, Eden Ravenscroft, was founded. And what was the hallmark of Eden Ravenscroft in 1689? They claimed to be the first company in the world to manufacture on a large scale Egyptian cotton shirts. Shirts made from the finest imported Egyptian cotton. So there you have this link between ancient Egypt, modern Egyptian cotton, and a number pattern that I've just sort of discovered myself by coincidence, but I think the ancient Egyptians would have been proud of. Moving on. We're now in, as you can see, St Giles Circus itself. Now you get the idea of this ancient crossing of roads. St Giles Circus is named after St Giles. St Giles was a 7th century Scottish saint, and the saint herself became known as the patron saint of the disabled. And that is why a monastery was built, or firstly a hospital for lepers, that then became a monastery, was built on this very spot. We're talking about early medieval period. Monastery went during the dissolution of the monasteries, 1536 onwards. But the name stuck. It became the area of St Giles. It is now a very small little square, as you can see, but you can also see really important London arterial roads that come out from that. Going north, Bloomsbury Road, which goes all the way up to the Hampstead Road and eventually to Hampstead and north of London. Going there west, New Oxford Street, that then leads into Oxford Street, that then goes west to, well, that's why it's called Oxford Street, west to Oxford. Then this road here, High Holborn, that eventually goes all the way to the Barbican and Holborn and to the east, way out east. So it's difficult to imagine now, but this was one of those great meeting points. And in the late medieval period, St Giles was the place of a daily market that would occur. So, looking at this side of St Giles, next to the ancient Egyptian house, look at this building, one of the very few buildings in London. It's the Baptist Central Chapel that is in possession of a rose window. I have mentioned rose windows before. One is in Christ the King, Gordon Square. One is in Westminster Abbey itself. Westminster Abbey, of course, is very early medieval. Christ the King, 19th century. This one here, 20th century, believe it or not, late 19th, very early 20th. But a very rare thing to come across rose windows, 2 a penny in France. But in England, it's an unusual thing. So moving slightly out of St Giles Circus now, we're coming round to one of London's most, hate to use the word, but I am going to use it in this sense because it's true, one of London's most iconic shops. It's a famous one. It is Smith & Sons, stick and umbrella makers. Let's go round. This shop has been trading in umbrellas, walking sticks and so on for, well, a long time, as you can see. There we are. It's on number 53 of New Oxford Street, and you can see there, you've got here James Smith & Sons, umbrella, warehouse and stick factory. This has been selling from these premises for well over 150 years. It is a wonderful shop to actually go in and buy things from. I say buy, their products are not cheap. I have a Hazelwood umbrella given to me by a particularly generous friend, I should add. But it's a magnificent thing and I've used it for just under a decade. So I'd recommend, even if you don't fancy spending the money on it, go in and have a look. It is an absolute beauty of a shop. And although this wasn't planned at all, look how they still keep polishing those brasses at the bottom there to keep it looking spick and span. It's a wonderful London institution. Moving round now, we're going to go to the second pub in the area, which is called the Crown. Now I want to say why this is called the Crown. It has an interesting story. So the Crown pub, entrance held up typically by wrought iron columns, the traditional columns in pubs. Why did so many pubs have wrought iron columns? Because pubs were places often of fights, of fires, of violence. They needed to be pretty tough places. They might look pretty with nice tile work and glass work, but they needed to be pretty robust. So this pub, the Crown, has been here for 3 centuries. Why here? Because this was being the circus, St Giles Circus, meant that it was a very useful place for the government to collect a small tax for people coming through the circus to go west to Oxford Street or north up to Hampstead or south to the river. This was a very useful little toll gate on toll booth to collect in taxes. So, therefore, the Crown, the government, collected taxes from this very spot. And therefore an inn that then changed into a pub became known as the Crown, because it was a place where the Crown collected revenues for all the thousands of people who were actually using the area. Moving on a little bit further, we're now going to cross to a particularly unusual street name. So now we're moving out of St Giles Circus and we're moving down the rather beautifully named Coptic Street. Follow me across the road and I'll tell you the story of Coptic Street. Just to give you a brief bit of background, the Copts are the ancient inhabitants of Egypt. We, most of the time, know Egypt as a country, Central Arab world, the most populous Arab country in the world, Cairo, the most populous Islamic city in the world, and being an Islamic country. But what is often forgotten is that between 12 and 15% of the population of Egypt are Copts, the ancient Christians of Egypt. Indeed, the word Copt is ancient Greek for Egyptian. Now, Egypt became Islamic in the 7th and 8th centuries. After the death of Muhammad, very rapidly Islam swept across North Africa, and we have the Fatimid period in Egypt that then moved into other periods, including the Mamluks, including the Ottomans. But the Copts remained there, which then begs the next question: why in the middle of London do we have a street called Coptic Street? And the answer for that is this building at the end of the street. It's an unusual and unexpected view of the British Museum. Now, the British Museum, of course, is physically a vast institution, not the biggest museum in London, I should add. In floor area, the biggest museum in the Victoria and Albert Museum. But the British Museum, of course, is a world institution. Now, Coptic Street used to be known by a different name. But in 1896, a huge amount of manuscripts were discovered in Egypt by British explorers and French explorers, and they were brought over to London and to the British Museum, where they remain to this day. I'm talking about millions and millions of pieces of Coptic manuscripts going all the way back to between 1500 and 1800 years old. For such an important find, the British Museum being their eventual home, it was felt there had to be something to commemorate that, and therefore the street opposite, one of the little streets opposite the British Museum, Coptic Street, now called, was given its new name, Coptic Street, and that has remained ever since. Moving out of Coptic Street, we go down to Little Russell Street. British Museum sits on Great Russell Street. This is Little Russell Street. Little Russell Street was, until just last year, home to a little-known museum in London, the Museum of Cartoons. There it is, the Cartoon Museum. It's now moved a few hundred metres to Covent Garden, but it's a great little museum, and I'd strongly recommend you going. The reason I've taken you down this street is because it's leading up to the final thing I want to explain to you, and that is two really important events. June the 8th, 1913, Emily Davidson, a leading suffragette, went down to the Epsom Derby. She wanted to make her point, as did lots of suffragettes, in a dramatic manner. She attended the Derby and ran on to the racecourse. There is much debate over whether this was suicide or whether it was not. It was a tragic, it was a dramatic thing for her to do. It ended with her death. And indeed, of all the horses that trampled her, it was the King's horse, the horse of George V, that actually trampled her. You can see it, it's there for people to see. If you go on the internet, watch the horrific little scene when she runs onto that course in very, very shaky black and white, but it's all there. She runs onto the race course and she's trampled and she dies. Undecided whether it was suicide or not, but of course it got the massive, massive publicity that suffragettes were always aiming for, to do with really getting that publicity for their cause. The verdict of the coroner's court was death by misadventure. Now, why do I mention that tragic story here? The reason I mention it here is because Emily Davidson was from up north, and her funeral took place in the north of England, but they had to get her body back from Epsom up to the north. So that meant going on two trains. The first train went from Victoria, which was close to Epsom, to London. Then they had to take the second train from King's Cross up to Newcastle upon Tyne, where she was finally buried in a place outside Newcastle upon Tyne called Morpeth. So there was that road journey that Emily Davidson had to take in between the two stations in London, and that road journey was said to have been lined with 50,000 suffragettes, all dressed in their white and purple colours of the suffragette movement. There was also said to have been up to 15,000 men standing there in tribute to her martyrdom, as they saw it, for the cause of the right of women to vote. So this was a remarkable thing, and many people see it as a death that was so dramatic and so tragic that it really did shift the debate over women's suffrage up a notch or two. But what is the connection with that and here? All of these side streets were ram-packed full of people. And the reason I mention it here is because it was decided to hold a brief funeral service, a funeral mass, for Emily Davidson at the church I'm about to show you. The second big event of this church was the funeral mass, not for a person, not for a people, but for a country. And that was Ethiopia, Abyssinia. October 1935, Mussolini invades Abyssinia, an act of flagrant aggression. And the result of that is the Emperor Haile Selassie, the Emperor of Ethiopia, begged the then League of Nations to help his country and his people to repel the Italian invaders. Nothing much happened. A report was written, discussions were held, an attempt to make a peace agreement was followed through, but it had no effect. In essence, Ethiopia, known then as Abyssinia, fell to the aggression of Mussolini, and the result was that Haile Selassie, the emperor, went into exile. In the midst of that crisis, he came to London, and he decided, again almost in the same vein as Emily Davidson had in 1935, to really go for the publicity, to get that knowledge out to the people of what was happening to his country. So he held in this church what he called a funeral mass for his country. A coffin was brought up the steps, just as Emily Davidson's coffin had been brought up the steps decades before. It was taken into the church, the coffin said Ethiopia on it, the mass was held. So this church has held many remarkable things. And now a word about the church. I suppose the first thing I should point out is the extraordinary and rather exotic spire. There you have it, a tower topped by a pyramidical spire. This church was designed by Nicholas Hawksmore, who, in my opinion, was one of the greatest, if not the greatest architect in this country's history. Nicholas Hawksmore, overshadowed often by his master, Christopher Wren, was the chief draftsman and trainee of Wren. In 1708, between 1708 and 1711, the Houses of Parliament passed a number of acts, and they were called the 15 New Churches Acts. The population of London was burgeoning, and it was decided that in order to give churches to the people, there being a fear that the people were becoming godless, many new churches had to be built. And the 50 Churches Act gave permission for 50 churches to be put up in London. Hawksmore was given the commission. However, he only managed to build 8 because, guess what? Public money dried up. Nothing new. So 8 churches were built, 2 of which were destroyed during the Blitz, 6 of which remain today. Christ Church Spitalfields in the East End of London, St Mary Woolnoth in the City of London, St George's Bloomsbury, St George's in the East on Cable Street where the fascists walked in the 1930s, St Anne's Limehouse right near the docks, and finally St Alphege Greenwich where Nicholas Hawksmore is in fact buried. This church is a wonderful thing, as are all of the Hawksmore churches. Powerful, the English Baroque style, much more restrained than the European Baroque style. Powerful, yet simple also. And that remarkable spire on top, that pyramidical spire, is based upon a structure 2,500 years old. It's based upon the tomb of the Emperor Mausolus, the ancient Greek king, 353 BC, he dies. He is buried in a tomb designed by him before he had died, and King Mausolus is buried in his tomb. Parts of that tomb remain within the British Museum, one of their prize exhibits. This is where, of course, we get the word a mausoleum from, because it was the tomb to King Mausolus. So he decided, Hawksmore, to use one of those 7 wonders of the world, the tomb of Mausolus, to go on top of his church tower, and sitting atop, or standing atop I should say, is a drum, And on top of the drum is a statue of Henry I of England, following the classical theme in toga and laurel leaves. At the bottom of those steps you have lions and unicorns. It's a wonderful structure. And now look at the frontage of the church. If we can just cross over. The front of the church is a handsome thing. It's based upon the great temple of Baalbek in current-day Syria. And you can see there that it has a double porch, deep, beautiful deep porch of columns, each one with a Corinthian capital, sitting atop a really handsome flight of steps. But, as with everything in London, London is such a city of contrasts. Here you have ancient world, here you have Corinthian columns, here you have High Holborn, and here, in the very front of the church, you have the Museum of Comedy. How many countries in the world would have, in one of their most beautiful churches within the town of the capital city in London, a museum devoted to comedy? It's just a fantastic juxtaposition of things. So I think we've achieved our object. We have packed in a heck of a lot just in a few minutes. And literally within a few metres, we have not walked longer than 150 metres from that original starting spot. But again, you can see the richness, the diversity, the amount of things there are to do in London, just in this tiny spot. Again, as if I needed to say it again, it just begins to drive home what a remarkable, what an absolutely phenomenal city this is. Finally, although this church is a church of history, it is a working church. There are services that go on here 3 or 4 times a week. And this is the way you would go into those services. The acoustics in this church are absolutely outstanding. And I would encourage you to come and try it for yourselves. Thank you for listening. Enjoy yourselves St Giles Circus when you do it one day. Bye-bye.